the fellows come where the flag waves over all. Though I love you so, it is time to go, and a soldier in me you'll find. When on land or sea they need boys like me, you would not have me stay behind.
Have you ever had a seemingly routine conversation that unexpectedly turned into something much bigger? It was late 2020, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. I was on the phone with my buddy, shredding guitarist and fellow aviator Joey Mullins of Denver, telling him about my plans for an upcoming expedition to western Colorado. He asked if we'd be going through Pagosa Springs, an epic Rocky Mountain town and hot springs at over 7,000 feet on the western slope of the Continental Divide, 35 miles north of the New Mexico border. I replied that we would indeed. Come to find out that the Veterans of Foreign Wars, or VFW post there in Pagosa, is named after his great-grandfather. I previously had no idea that Joe had any connection with that town or a family history of military service, so I asked him to elaborate. This is the story of the Mullins boys of the World Wars.
I love you so, it is time to go, and a soldier in me you'll find. When on land
Lester Wayne Mullins was born in 1899 near Joplin, Missouri, to William Mullins, a 28-year-old barber from Pullman County, Missouri, and his newlywed wife, Clorinda, who everyone called Clara. Less than a year later, hoping to find better opportunities, the Mullins family embarked with 4 other families and 7 covered wagons for an 800-mile journey west to Pagosa Springs. Horse-drawn wagons averaged about 2 miles per hour and could only cover 15 to 20 miles a day, so it took at least a month just to cross the wide-open Great Plains of Kansas and eastern Colorado and get within sight of the Rocky Mountains. They crossed the San Juan mountain range at Elwood Pass, then followed the east fork of the San Juan River all the way down to Pagosa Springs. William opened a barber shop, and the couple soon welcomed a second son, Earl, and a daughter, Ruibel, who sadly passed away in 1903. In 1906, William purchased a new fancy building for the Mullins barber shop on Pagosa Street, which is the main drag. It's still there. Those 2 brothers, Lester and Earl, were boisterous and inseparable, and were usually seldom to be seen as they were off exploring the wilds of the incomparable San Juan Mountain region of the Great Rocky Mountains of Colorado. Like most boys of their age and status, they became highly skilled outdoorsmen, marksmen, and hunters. Those skills would soon serve Lester in particular quite well for a time. In 1916, at the age of 17, Lester was courting a petite and stylish local girl named Bessie Murray, who was a year younger, and got her pregnant. This was quite scandalous in post-Victorian times when, for example, it was still considered impolite for a man to be seen outdoors in public without a hat. Bessie's outraged father told Lester, "There's either going to be a shotgun wedding or a shotgun funeral. You pick." A private civil ceremony was hastily arranged, and shortly thereafter, just before Christmas, 1916, Bessie delivered a healthy baby boy, who they named Gilbert Thomas Mullins. Gilbert was clearly a happy little guy, and for a time it seemed that the young couple had a bright future together. But it was not to be. The instant he turned 18, Lester skedaddled and enlisted in the U.S. Marine Corps, which was actively recruiting in anticipation of America's potential involvement in World War I. Bessie, suddenly on her own with a newborn infant and no income, was none too happy. By the way, this was not only the tail end of the prude Victorian era, but the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Most houses in Pagosa Springs still did not have indoor plumbing or electricity. There were just a handful of the newfangled automobiles in the entire county, and decent-paying work opportunities for honest women were scarce at best. By this point, the war to end all wars had already been raging overseas for 2 long years and millions of casualties. And after witnessing the unprecedented slaughter just across the pond, the American War Department quietly ordered that only unmarried men with no children would be accepted for frontline combat service with the Allied Expeditionary Force, then being prepared for deployment to the battlefields of Europe. That policy was mainly intended to avoid large numbers of widows and fatherless kids back in the USA, which the Wilson administration believed would sour public opinion on America's involvement in the European War. Lester, however, was apparently desperate to get out of Dodge and see the world. So he swore up and down to the Marine recruiter that he was both single and childless, signed on the dotted line, and was hustled immediately onto a steam locomotive train bound for Farmington, New Mexico for physical examination. After in-processing, Lester was on a different railroad line headed straight to boot camp at the famed Marine Recruit Depot at Parris Island, South Carolina, which had opened less than a year earlier and is still making Marines well into the 21st century. He may not have been cut out for teenage fatherhood, but it seems clear that Lester Mullins took to Marine Corps training and discipline like a duck to water. Matter of fact, he was such a squared-away Marine that after he passed advanced training as a machine gunner with flying colors, the Corps selected Private Lester Mullins to appear in its swanky new national recruiting campaign in all the top magazines of the day. His mom, Clara, proudly wrote a little note on this one, pointing him out. For a fuzz-faced Pagosa Springs boy to be standing at attention in starched dress uniform with white gloves on the deck of a state-of-the-art warship steaming for exotic ports with his model 1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle at the order arms position and his officers' drawn cavalry sabers shimmering in the Atlantic Ocean sun had to be nothing short of mind-boggling. Based on a handful of clues in this picture, as well as the known movements of these big ships during World War I have conclusively identified this as a Florida-class dreadnought battleship, which means it is either the USS Florida or the USS Utah, commissioned in 1909 and 1910 respectively. Both ships were attached to the British Grand Fleet in 1917 and 18 as part of the 6th Battle Squadron, escorting convoys across the Atlantic and blockading the German coast. These ships were over 500 feet long, with coal-fired boilers and 10 12-inch Mark V main guns in 5 twin turrets, 2 forward and 3 aft, all of which could fire broadside, which was unusual at the time and a big advantage over older warships. They had steel armor almost a foot thick at the waterline. Ironically, these vessels were designed mostly in response to a British warship launched just a few years earlier, the HMS Dreadnought. Each 12-inch gun could fire 2 or 3 870-pound high-explosive, armor-piercing rounds per minute out to a maximum range of about 20,000 yards, or more than 11 miles, and each barrel had to be replaced after only 175 shots. Florida-class battleships could make 21 knots, or about 25 miles an hour, and had a crew of over 1,000 officers and men. These ships were the superweapons of their day, and of course mega expensive. And these Marines were, and still are, the U.S. Navy's trusted shipboard security force. Lester's company of Marines here was probably just hitching a ride over on an Atlantic convoy escort cruise. And after several weeks aboard ship, he was probably relieved to step ashore in France in February of 1918, assigned to the 6th Marine Regiment, which had been organized just months before under the command of Medal of Honor winner and former Naval Academy football team captain, colonel, and later one-star general Albertus Catlin. Catlin was severely wounded in the coming battle at Belleau Wood and replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Harry Lee, himself a Silver Star recipient and later 2-star general, who also had a pretty large Navy ship named after him in the next World War. Private Mullins and his 6th Regiment Marines were attached to the American 2nd Division under a highly decorated Army West Pointer, Major General Omar Bundy, veteran of the American Indian, Spanish-American, and Philippine-American wars, plus the Pancho Villa expeditions in Mexico. Lester Mullins, however, after getting a full taste of life in the muddy, rat-infested, and extremely hazardous front-line trenches around a serene and beautiful collection of wheat fields and tidy forests about 50 miles northeast of Paris, apparently had some sort of change of heart. He went to his sergeant, who was extremely busy trying to get his young, combat-inexperienced platoon ready for the imminent attack against heavily armed and fortified German positions. Lester confessed to the sergeant that he had lied about his marital and fatherhood status upon enlistment and was therefore not supposed to be serving at the front lines. He apparently expected to be immediately kicked out of the Marine Corps and sent back to Colorado, which is exactly what he wanted. But, to his surprise, the sergeant, after laughing out loud at his predicament, probably said something like, "Tell it to someone who gives a shit. Now get back to your position, private." Lacking any other alternative, Lester, in one of his many letters, desperately turned to the still seething Bessie back in Colorado, begging her to inform the Marine Corps that he lied and should be sent home in disgrace. Having been essentially abandoned with a newborn baby, Bessie's reply was short, predictable, and to the point. "You got yourself over there, you can get yourself home." And on June 11th, 1918, just after receiving her response, Private Lester Mullins was killed during his unit's first combat engagement while gallantly attacking a German machine gun nest in the opening phases of the now famous battle at Belleau Wood. He was mortally wounded by 2 bullets, most likely fired from a 7.92 mm Maschinengewehr MG-08 Spandau heavy machine gun, which ironically was a German adaptation of the American-made Maxim gun. Lester was only 19 years old. His body was found as the battle raged all around by a fellow Marine named D.A. Gomez, who, after the war, listed his residence as Cabazon, New Mexico, which has been a classic ghost town since the late 1940s. Gomez was sheltering in a shell crater with another Marine when he looked over and saw a man lying lifeless a few yards away and recognized his face as a childhood schoolmate from near his hometown. I'm still trying to find out, hopefully through records from the 1900 U.S. Census, if they knew each other by pure chance, or if the Marines knowingly sent men that grew up and enlisted together into combat together, like the Brits did early in the war with their PALS battalions. Gomez ran over to Lester but had to dive back into the shell crater when the German machine guns opened up. When the fire shifted elsewhere, he crawled back and, hugging the dirt next to Lester, removed his identification tags — they weren't yet called dog tags — along with an unsent letter to Lester's mother. In World War I, the science of logistics and supply wasn't quite perfected, and water was scarce, so Gomez also took Lester's canteen, which had been grazed but not punctured by at least 2 additional bullets, and hooked it on his own belt. He also saw that Lester was wearing a beautiful gold ring, a ring later specifically mentioned in a letter from Lester's widow, and wanted to make sure it got back to the family, but removing jewelry from an Allied casualty was a serious court-martial offense, so he left it with the body. Mr. Gomez narrowly survived the battle at Belleau Wood and later wrote some incredibly moving and informative letters to Lester's mother, Clara, and widow, Bessie, telling them what had occurred. Lester Mullins was Archuleta County's first casualty of World War I, and he lies buried in the Chateau Thierry Military Cemetery to this day. Along with places like Iwo Jima, Chosin, Khe Sanh, and Fallujah, Belleau Wood remains hallowed ground to all Marines. It was the battle that put them on the map, so to speak, transforming a small anti-pirate maritime unit into the global combat powerhouse of World War II and today. It's also where the Marines earned a nickname that they are immodestly proud of, bestowed upon them by their German enemies, who consider them insanely brave but viciously mean-spirited and murderous barbarians. The Germans called them Teufelhunden, which means devil hounds. The Marines promptly Americanized that to devil dogs and even featured it in their official recruiting ads at the time. Some of the most famous quotes in Corps history were uttered at Belleau Wood. First Sergeant Dan Daly, who already had not 1 but 2 Medals of Honor, yelled to the young Marines of the 73rd Machine Gun Company as he led them over the top, "Come on, you sons of bitches, you want to live forever?" Every man followed without hesitation, advancing through waist-high golden wheat, and most were quickly cut down by a hellstorm of artillery, machine gun, and sniper fire. The Germans, deeply impressed by such unflinching bravery, even used mustard gas, a toxic blistering agent, which caused numerous cases of lung damage and blindness. The few Americans that made it all the way to the German positions were immediately engaged in hand-to-hand fighting to the death, The Marines suffered over 8,000 casualties in just about a month, far more than even predicted by the U.S. War Department. But those devil dogs secured a foothold at Belleau Wood, and an epic place in the history and lore of the U.S. Marine Corps, which takes such things quite seriously for obvious reasons. To this day, Marines serving with the 5th and 6th Regiments wear the fourragère, a braided cord on the left shoulder of their dress uniforms, in recognition of the valor of men like Private Lester Mullins. A century after the battle, most military historians believed that just about everything that could be known about this campaign was already on the books, but they were wrong. Official Marine Corps history held that there were no direct descendants of the casualties at Belleau Wood because they were all supposed to be unmarried men with no kids. Little Gilbert Mullins, who was just 2 when his daddy fell in France, and his descendants were a secret to history for almost 100 years. And by the way, in one of those cruel, cold twists of war, Bessie learned that she was a widow when one of Lester's letters arrived as usual from France, but with the envelope prominently stamped deceased. She was supposed to be notified by Western Union telegram, personally signed by the very first commandant of the Marine Corps, Major General George Barnett. However, that was not delivered until 111 days after Lester's death, with, by the way, a completely erroneous date of loss. Bessie Mullins, who had already been getting on with her life, moved from Pagosa to the thriving metropolis of Denver, where she worked for a time as a secretary for the Catholic Archdiocese. Skilled at administration, she was encouraged to apply for a position with the federal government and was soon working for the Civilian Conservation Corps at Fort Logan, the Army Quartermaster and Medical Corps at Fitzsimmons General Hospital in Denver, and the U.S. Army War Department at Lowry Field. She remarried to a train conductor named Edward Hughes, and they had a son, also named Edward. But for reasons unknown to me, Bessie sent her firstborn, Gilbert, who was still a toddler, back to Pagosa Springs to be raised by his father Lester's younger brother, Earl, and his wife, Thelma. Uncle Earl was, at that time, learning the art and science of barbering from his father while working in the Mullins family barbershop. As a growing boy, Gilbert spent many hours in that establishment. It was a warm, rustic place decorated with elk, deer, and ram horns, eagle feathers, and a diverse collection of firearms. Also, like his father, Lester, Gilbert was slight of stature but quick-witted, charming, confident, and handsome, and grew up exploring the same wilds around the San Juan Mountain region, becoming an expert marksman, hunter, and outdoorsman. After graduating from Pagosa Springs High School in 1935, he headed off to Colorado State College in Fort Collins, which is in the north part of the state, where he was a cadet in the Army ROTC program. But in a unique twist of history, just like his father, Gilbert was of prime military service age precisely when another world war was heating up, and America's involvement seemed likely, if not imminent. He received a legacy appointment to West Point, but contracted the measles and had to drop out in his freshman year. After recovering, he joined the U.S. Army Air Corps and was selected for the Aviation Cadet Program. His initial training was at Glendale, California, and in July 1940, at Kelly Field, San Antonio, Texas, he received his wings and was commissioned a second lieutenant. He'd performed well enough to be chosen for advanced training as an elite fighter pilot with the 77th and 79th Pursuit Squadrons of the 20th Pursuit Group in California, North and South Carolina, and Florida in preparation for combat overseas. It bears remembering that airplanes had been invented only a few decades earlier, and fighter pilots were still a novel and highly celebrated class of warriors, romantically portrayed in the press and films as deadly but chivalrous knights of the air. Fighter pilots of any nationality rarely had to buy their own drinks while back home on leave in wartime, and several dated and even married gorgeous movie starlets and other high society dames. They were rock stars of the day. Gilbert sailed by troopship through waters prowled by deadly German U-boats to the Saharan deserts of North Africa, and within hours of disembarking was flying ground attack combat missions in Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighter bombers with the 8th Fighter Wing supporting the British Army all over North Africa, Italy, and the Mediterranean. He also fought with the 12th Air Force's 57th Fighter Group, 64th Fighter Squadron, the Black Scorpions, which flew both the P-40 Warhawk and the P-47 Thunderbolt. World War II fighter pilots did not yet have semi-officially assigned personal call signs like today's jet jocks do, but Gilbert nonetheless earned an awesome nickname. In early 1944, he was in a P-40 Warhawk at full throttle below and between the walls of a deep desert canyon, hoping to shoot up and bomb a column of German troop trucks and staff cars reported to be creeping along the road somewhere ahead. Suddenly, an enemy half-track slithered over the ridgeline just ahead and above. He could see the infamous Maltese Cross just as clear as day, and the machine gun barrels now frantically swinging in his direction. In a matter of seconds, they would be able to shoot down on him as he went by below like a fat fish in a shallow barrel. Gilbert rolled hard left and pulled into an almost vertical climb, centered the gun sight on that black cross, and squeezed off a burst of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds from his 4 Browning M2 machine guns at point-blank range. The supersonic torrent of bullets exploded the half-track's fuel and ammunition in an enormous fireball laced with large metal chunks dead ahead. As he punched through the burning cloud, there was a loud thump to the left, where, to his consternation, a section of the German vehicle's tank-like tracks was now embedded in the front edge of the wing. The unbalanced aerodynamic drag rendered the airplane nearly uncontrollable, but he was way too low to bail out. These airplanes did not have ejection seats. So, out of airspeed and options, Gilbert instinctively slammed the control stick and rudder pedals around, violently shaking the plane like a wet dog. To his immense relief, the track pried loose under the sudden G-forces and slammed into the desert floor just yards below, with his astonished wingman looking on. The reduction in drag was just enough to allow him to begin a slow climb, and he was able to nurse the damaged plane all the way back to base over some of the most hostile desert on Earth. Forever thereafter, Gil Mullins was known to his squadron mates as Half-Track, and to my knowledge, he is the only pilot ever to destroy an enemy armored vehicle from below. By 1944, at the age of only 28, he was a lieutenant colonel and deputy commander of the 86th Fighter Bomber Group, a veteran 12th Air Force dive bombing unit then in combat over Italy and Sicily. The 86th Group flew the little-known North American A-36 Invader, also known as the Apache, which was a specialized ground attack version of the famous P-51 Mustang air-to-air fighter, but with a different engine and gun configuration, along with bomb racks and slatted dive brakes added to the wings. Only about 500 were made, and they were flown only in the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia theaters. Colonel Mullins flew many different machines during his Army service, including the P-51, the Douglas C-47 Dakota, also known as the DC-3 in civilian use, various mid-sized transports, and celebrated trainers like the North American T-6 Texan and Stearman Cadet biplanes. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied invasion of Europe, Gilbert was over the French Riviera, leading missions to attack German tanks, troop trucks, and trains. He was flying a Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, known to its pilots as the Jug, owing to its rather portly build. The Jug had tremendous firepower, with 8 forward-firing 50 caliber machine guns in the wings, putting out a total of over 100 huge, heavy, high-velocity rounds a second at the flick of the pilot's right index finger. These planes were the nemesis of countless enemy trains, planes, and automobiles, and Gilbert Mullins sent more than his fair share into oblivion. Under each wing of his plane was also a 500-pound bomb, probably scribbled with the usual insults to Hitler and the Nazis. And, wired to the tail fins of one of those bombs, was a solid gold man's ring. You see, just before he left the States for the war, then Captain Mullins was having dinner at a New York City restaurant when a man in civilian clothes walked by, then stopped and turned, staring intently at the silver pilot wings on the left chest of Gilbert's uniform. As Gilbert looked up, the man extended his hand and introduced himself as William Radabow of Camden, New Jersey, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a gold ring. "Tie this to one of your bombs sometime. My brother would like that." He went on to explain that his brother was an Army Air Corps transport pilot who'd recently been killed in a training accident just before going overseas. He pressed the ring into Gilbert's hand, whispered a choked up "thank you," and walked out of the restaurant. All across North Africa, the Mediterranean, Italy, and Sicily, that ring had been in the pocket of Gilbert's leather flying jacket, awaiting the opportune moment. Today, he would have a God's eye view of the greatest military armada and invasion force ever assembled in human history.
General quarters, all hands man your battle stations, all hands.
So, just before strapping in and blasting out over the English Channel for France, he attached the dead pilot's ring to a bomb and vowed to make it count. An hour later, that ring, riding its deadly delivery boy, slammed into a string of enemy railway boxcars packed to the gills with ammo and ordnance, awaiting delivery to German forces who were desperately trying to push the Allied invaders back into the Channel. By the war's end, Colonel Mullins had earned an Air Medal with 2 oak leaf clusters and the French Croix de Guerre, or Cross of War, for conspicuous acts of bravery in the face of the enemy on D-Day. Back in the States, he commanded Fairfax Army Airfield just north of Kansas City, Kansas, before retiring and returning to Pagosa Springs and a hero's welcome in 1946. He studied law for a spell, but soon recognized that flying was the only thing he wanted to do. So he became a civilian commercial pilot, flying all sorts of interesting missions for over 25 years. He prospected for a famous philosopher, Renaissance man, and uranium miner, Vernon Pick, who is still called the American Uranium King. Gilbert would fly around low over suspected uranium ore sites while looking at the readout on a Geiger counter-like device called a scintillator, which detected small amounts of unusual radiation. Throughout the 1960s, he fought wildfires, flying the spotter planes that guide the big bombers in to make their drops, and did extensive work for the New Mexico Fish and Game Department, transporting gear, supplies, and people to remote airstrips all around the state. He even flew executive transport and supply missions for the Navajo Nation and was a big fan of Native American culture, outdoor skills, and especially warrior tradition. Gilbert's wife and high school sweetheart, Dorothy Hayden Mullins, was from Aztec, New Mexico, not far from tribal lands, and she once worked for the Atomic Energy Commission and other government agencies. They had one child, Patrick, born in 1941, while his father was away training to fly fighter planes overseas. At some point, Patrick got the nickname Moon, apparently after the Moon Mullins comic strip that ran from 1923 to 1991. By his early 20s, Moon was himself an elite U.S. Air Force nuclear missile technician at the height of the Cold War, retiring as a master sergeant after over 20 years of working around extremely toxic and explosive liquid rocket fuels, W-53 thermonuclear warheads with the explosive power of more than 1,000 Hiroshima bombs. By 1972, Moon's dad, Gilbert, World War II fighter pilot and son of World War I hero Lester Mullins, was living in the northwestern New Mexico city of Farmington, flying inspection patrols along the crude oil and natural gas pipelines that crisscrossed the region. If he spotted a leak or other problem, he'd radio maintenance crews on the ground who drove out to make repairs. By the age of only 55, he had amassed over 15,000 hours of flight time. In the cockpit of any flying machine, this man was like a fish in water, doing exactly what he was born to do. The morning of Saturday, May 6, 1972, dawned bright and sunny, with high, wispy clouds and only a hint of a breeze. Excellent flying weather. At 1506 Zuni Drive, near downtown Farmington, Gil Mullins kissed Dorothy goodbye and got in his red 65 Ford half-ton short-bed V8 pickup truck for the 7-minute drive west to Four Corners Regional Airport. He stopped in at the flight service station, received a weather briefing, and filed his standard Pipeline Patrol VFR flight plan so that air traffic controllers would know his intentions and could provide radar traffic advisories.
Traffic 12 o'clock, 6 miles, head on final 757 out of 2000. Just crossing.
His pre-flight walk-around inspection of the white and light blue four-seater Cessna 182 Skylane he'd be flying that day was probably even more thorough than usual. The plane was owned by a small outfit called Tota Aviation of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and leased by Gleason Roman Pipeline Patrol Company, also out of Tulsa. Gleason Roman held contracts with big companies like Shell Oil to inspect crude oil pipelines in New Mexico and all around the U.S. Unfortunately, Gilbert was not happy with the penny-pinching maintenance being done on the airplane, especially when the plane's 230 horsepower Continental 0470 engine, which is an air-cooled six-cylinder, had suddenly started burning far more oil than normal. It's a very bad sign for reliability. It's especially troubling when you're operating a single-engine plane, mostly over remote desert canyons and other terrain inhospitable to making a safe emergency landing. He probably considered finding a different company to fly for, but that was easier said than done. This was at the very end of the Vietnam War, and highly experienced and far younger pilots with recent combat and jet time were literally a dime a dozen. Airline jobs were all taken, and other decent-paying flying jobs few and far between. So, 55 years old with a wife and mortgage, Colonel Mullins stuck it out, fully aware that the excessive oil burn was a potential ticking time bomb. Even so, with over 3,000 hours in this type aircraft alone, he was probably confident of handling whatever was thrown at him and walking away unscathed, just as he always had during 30-plus years of flying. The plane's tail number and radio call sign was November 71503. N numbers are sort of similar to a car's license plate numbers. However, unlike car plates, they are more or less permanently assigned to each plane and painted onto the side of the fuselage or vertical tail, usually in big block letters. This makes it easier for nosy people on the ground to rat you out to the feds if you were allegedly flying too low or otherwise trying to have a little fun in life. After completing his patrol just after 10 a.m., near a now abandoned private airstrip called Apache Station, Gilbert was supposed to reverse back to the west and make a beeline for Farmington Airport, a compass bearing of about 295 degrees magnetic. However, he instead turned north and descended from his patrol altitude of 500 feet right down into Largo Canyon. The reason for this deviation will probably never be known for certain, but there are two primary theories. The first is that he was attempting to spot a herd of exotic Barbary sheep, also called audads. In the late 1940s, these animals, along with other African species such as oryx, ibex, and pronghorn antelope, were imported by the New Mexico Fish and Game Department from the Atlas Mountains of North Africa, which span Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Gilbert Mullins, who was a lifelong hunter and conservationist, reportedly told a friend that on a previous pipeline patrol flight to the same area, he had attempted to find the sheep but could not get low enough due to poor weather and severe turbulence, but was planning to try again at the next opportunity. Those sheep blend right into the canyon walls, so you would have to get down really low to have any chance of spotting them. The second theory was that he was looking for the ruins of an ancient Anasazi cliff dwelling. He had previously taken his son Moon on at least one flight over the same general area to look for them. Whatever the actual reason, there is no question that he made a technically unauthorized detour. At about 10:20 a.m., a 41-year-old worker and U.S. Navy Korean War veteran named Paul Lewis Payne was driving a Southern Union Gas Company truck north along County Road 379, which is the rugged and spectacularly beautiful dirt track that snakes along the west side of the Largo River. Just off to his left, to the west, was a 200-foot-high vertical rock canyon face, adorned in many places with ancient Anasazi petroglyphs. On his right was the usually dry Largo riverbed and its bright white beach-like sand, and of course the opposite canyon wall, which is about 1,700 feet to the east. Mr. Payne lived with his family at the isolated but beautiful Lindrith camp 5 miles to the south in one of the small company row houses that once existed in what is now called Lindrith Compressor Station. He told investigators that he suddenly saw a small airplane emerge from a side canyon and enter another before eventually reappearing, banking sharply north and descending down to about 50 feet above the riverbed in the main channel of Largo Canyon. He said the left wing dug into the ground and the plane cartwheeled out of sight, probably behind the riverbank or creek vegetation, which was fairly tall at the time due to heavy rainfall. By the way, this matches the forensic evidence since glass shards from the red navigation light, which is always mounted on the left wingtip, were found at the first ground scar. Payne drove further north and regained sight of the plane after about a minute or so. It had come to rest and was engulfed in bright orange flames, fed by around 30 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline, sending a thick plume of black smoke high into the blue desert sky. What he did not realize was that a few seconds before plowing into the ground, the plane had flown through a set of 4 high-voltage electrical power line cables spanning the canyon, east and west. Payne stopped on the road and ran out into the riverbed to the crash scene, which was near the far eastern bank, but it was soon obvious that there was nothing to be done for the pilot. This was long before mobile phones, so Lewis Payne drove to the nearest gas company shop 5 miles away and called the local sheriff's office to report the crash. Lieutenant Colonel Gilbert T. Mullins, World War II hero, master aviator, public servant, conservationist, father and grandfather, was dead. Dorothy Mullins, Gilbert's wife of 30-plus years and now a widow, was, of course, completely devastated by his sudden, seemingly senseless loss. Not only that, but just a few days after the crash, she received a letter from Gilbert's employer saying that the life insurance policy on him, for which she was the sole beneficiary, had been canceled. She considered filing a wrongful death suit, but based on the unavoidable fact that Gilbert had flown off his beat, so to speak, their son, Patrick Moon Mullins, who was then a 31-year-old Air Force staff sergeant stationed at Little Rock, Arkansas, had the sad duty of telling her that it was a lost cause. Dorothy never remarried, and for reasons unknown, she kept all records, artifacts, and photos relating to war heroes Lester and Gilbert Mullins strictly secret, even from the rest of the family, until they were discovered in her home after she passed away in 2020 at 100 years old. As previously mentioned, Gilbert's grandson, who never got to meet him, is my good buddy, Joey Mullins. And when he offhandedly mentioned that the family had almost no information about the plane crash, what happened, where, and why, I decided to try and help bring some closure to my friend and his family. It started with a midnight search of the NTSB's aviation accident database, which yielded the basic reports and findings of probable cause, and little did I know, would trigger a 5-month quest that would reveal a uniquely fascinating and multifaceted story of father and son American heroes from Pagosa Springs, Colorado.
It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know.